Welcome to our update on the Provider Relief Payments webinar. This is part 2 of the webinar that we did previously related to the same topic. Again, we're bringing you this webinar in partnership with NHIA. As an aside, this webinar should be viewed in conjunction with the FAQs that we've posted on the NHIA Husch Blackwell portal. If you haven't already, please visit the portal and sign up. As always, I am joined by my colleague, Erica Ash.
Hi, Wakaba. I'm so happy to be here. And we just wanted to point out again that these webinars aren't meant to be legal advice. Rather, we're just trying to give you an overview of what's going on. But to the extent that you have specific questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to either Wakaba or myself. So as Wakaba mentioned earlier, this webinar is an update to our previous recording, which we released a couple weeks ago. So today, we're going to keep talking about the Provider Relief Fund. We're going to talk about the payments that have yet to be allocated. So that's going to be first the $20 billion as a general allocation under the CARES Act, and the $50 billion in targeted allocations under the CARES Act. And then we're going to wrap it up by talking about the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act that was passed last week that we alluded to, and what that means for NHIA members.
All right, so let's talk about the CARES Act general allocation. Just as a recap, under the CARES Act, there were $100 billion allocated to aid providers during the pandemic. $50 billion of that was for targeted funds that were going to be allocated, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then there was another $50 billion that was called the General Allocation Fund. The first $30 billion, which we're going to refer to as the first tranche, that was distributed to providers on, I think they said it was April 10th and 17th, or between April 10th and 17th. So you should have received that money already, and that was discussed in our first webinar. The way they calculated that was based on Medicare fee-for-service revenue. And on this slide, we're going to talk about the $20 billion. And so we're going to call this the second tranche. So that's the $20 billion that's still left from the $50 billion in the General Allocation Fund. So to be eligible for this $20 billion, the second tranche, you need to have already received the first allocation from that first tranche, the $30 billion. And that would have landed in your bank account with I think it said HHS payment from Optum. Now, if you, and we're going to go into more details in the next slide, there were some clients of ours that had this second tranche of money deposited into their bank account. Some got emails about it saying, hey, you might be eligible for the second tranche of money. And so either way, right, I think you still need to go into what we are calling the Provider Relief Fund application portal to go through the exercise of putting in information. So Erica, do you want to walk us through what information you'll need to be prepared to provide when you go into the Provider Relief Fund application portal?
Yeah, definitely. And to back up a quick second too, so the purpose of splitting it up into two payments like this was to kind of try and even out the playing field. So the first payment went out with that kind of more simple formula because they wanted to get it out really quickly. So in this second round, they're trying to kind of even it out because maybe, some providers don't bill Medicare fee-for-service as much and they have more bundled payments, but, they're still going to need money to help stay afloat. So that's kind of the reasoning behind the documents they're asking for in this second tranche of money to get it. So first, you're going to need an estimate of your gross receipts. And so we have some questions around this, and it hasn't been completely clear. And there's been a lot of different guidance based on what that means. So we're going to talk about that in the next slide. The second thing you're going to need is your estimated lost revenue in March and April of this year due to COVID-19. And so the revenue is actually a really broad, you can estimate it in a few different ways. So examples that they gave in the FAQ were you could look at your revenue for March and April last year, and then what's the difference? Or, maybe you have some projections because you were growing and you have some projections of what March and April were supposed to look like, you can also use those numbers versus what you actually got. And then the third thing is a copy of your most recently filed tax return, and that's going to have to be from 2017, 2018, or 2019. They said if you don't have a tax return from any of those 3 years, your accountant is probably falling down on the job. One, that you should also go and file that before you apply. So, and then the last thing is a listing of any subsidiary tax ID numbers. Now, this gets a little tricky, but not really. So the subsidiaries you're going to include are any subsidiaries that are filed, the taxes are filed with the parent. So if the subsidiaries' taxes are filed separately on their own, you're going to do a separate provider relief fund application portal submission for them. And so essentially, let's say you have a parent and a sub that files taxes together. You're just going to aggregate all the data and include the TIN. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. Thanks, Erica.
So Wakaba, dealing with regulatory guidance is normally confusing, and we deal with it every day. Can you explain what is so confusing about the second tranche of money and all the guidance that's come out?
Sure. So yes, usually this is our jam, but even we're really confused. So we're going to try to explain why we're confused here and why we're waiting for additional guidance. I guess before we start, I just want to point out that after the first tranche came out, we put out FAQs related to the use of that money, how did you get it, all of that. That's posted on the NHIA portal. We have not updated it since because of all of the confusion surrounding the second tranche, which we're going to talk about now. So to the extent that CMS releases additional guidance, we will update that, but right now we just don't feel like we're in a position to be able to do that. And here's why. First of all, there are two portals. That alone is confusing, right? So what we're going to call the attestation portal is something that the providers need to go in and attest to following the receipt of the first tranche of money. Then there's the application portal. Now that CMS says is something that you either access if you had the second tranche go into your bank account automatically on the 24th of April, or if you want to apply for additional money following the receipt of your first tranche of money and you thought that you needed more. So that's what we're going to refer to as the application portal. Now, what's interesting here is that, okay, so there's two different portals. What's interesting is that when you used to access the attestation portal, it looked a little bit different than the application portal. And now we're really kind of getting into the calculation of the eligible funds. But as you recall, the first tranche was calculated based on fee for service because, right, as Erica mentioned, they wanted to quickly get it out. And so they used fee for service billing claims, and then they calculated that money. Now with the second tranche coming up, CMS has said when you actually go into that application portal, it says don't attest to anything if you think you've been overpaid any money. And that overpayment amount is either that you got overpaid with the first tranche of money or you got overpaid because you automatically got a second tranche of money. Either way, what CMS seems to be asking us is that we are supposed to calculate whether or not we are owed that the money that we received or that we're requesting is not quote unquote an overpayment, right, Erica?
Correct. And what also is a little bit confusing and what attorneys really don't like is that, so the terms and conditions, maybe, let's say you went on and signed the attestation portal and did everything, filled it out the very first day. Well, now the terms and conditions have been updated and changed. So does that retroactively apply to everyone who's already attested? Does it only apply to the extent that you haven't gone in and attested and attest after these terms and conditions have changed? It's not 100% clear as of right now. And then another thing that Wakaba and I weren't, it seemed clear at first, and now it seems like maybe it's not clear, is whether or not everyone has to go into the application portal, whether you want the second tranche of money or not, and submit your financial information. So that isn't 100% clear. It seemed like from all of the guidance at first, let's say you get the first tranche and you say, oh, this is more than sufficient. I'm not going to go in because I don't need the second tranche. And I'm, my home infusion business has been even more flourishing than it was before COVID because people don't want to go to the hospital. So really, I'm not losing money because of COVID. Well, from all the guidance we saw up until yesterday, we would have advised clients most likely that, okay, well, if you're good with your payment, then you don't need to do anything further. And now it's pretty unclear. So
Right, and it's unclear. It was to the point where yesterday, that was April 30th, if you went into the attestation portal with Internet Explorer, it said one thing, and if you used Google Chrome, it said another thing. But now, as of May 1, it was around 8:30 that we checked it, I think. If you go into the attestation portal, which is related to the first tranche, it does have information that says, hey, you need to calculate your expected combined general distribution, and you need to supply us with the information that Erica outlined in the previous slide. So it's really unclear to us who is required to go in and do it, whether it's everyone or if it's just the providers that want money from the second tranche or who have already received it. So that's a huge question that we just don't know. Another thing we want to point out too is that we have a copy of the overpayment or potential overpayment expected combined general distribution calculation, and it says individual provider revenues. That term has changed depending on where you look at. So sometimes it will reference gross sales, sometimes it will reference program service revenue, and sometimes it will reference net patient revenue. And obviously here it says individual provider revenue, which was pulled from an email that went out to providers that CMS sent out. So there's just a bunch of questions going on right now. We don't really know all the answers. We're really hoping that CMS puts out additional clarification questions. And CMS itself seems to not understand at all because, Erica, you called CMS Provider Relief Line yesterday, right? And I think you were a little frustrated when you first got on the phone.
They didn't really know even what I was talking about. And to be fair, that was the United phone number, the 1-800 number that's United list. And so the service provider from United seemed to think that you did not have to fill out the application for the second tranche. But like Wakaba and I said, this guidance is changing daily. So even if you talk to someone at CMS and you get one answer, you could talk to someone at CMS an hour later and get a different answer, which I know one of our colleagues has experienced. So I think that they're doing their best to get this money out quickly and to help providers as much as they can, which I think has made the process not as tight as CMS typically is when it gives payments. So I think that that's kind of what everyone's experiencing. And obviously no one has dealt with a pandemic like COVID-19 before, not on this scale at least. So that's part of it as well.
And I think the value that we can add just from us being healthcare compliance attorneys is that from a compliance perspective, you really want to make sure that you keep really good, adequate records of what you did with the money, which language of the attestation portal you signed. Do you have policies and procedures related to how you're going to use this intended money? It might not be a bad idea to maybe prepare for making a decision with respect to, are you going to refund the money now? Are you going to keep it? Are you going to keep it but not sign the terms and conditions? And that really is something that should be discussed with your attorney or an accountant if you have one, if you've hired one to go through the calculation of the expected combined general distribution. Here we've set out the CMS website and FAQ links. I think those do change regularly, so we encourage you to check those out as well. Okay, so let's now talk about the rest of the money, which is the remaining $50 billion, which is the targeted allocations. Now, these were specifically set aside for certain providers, and it's mainly hospitals, right, Erica?
Yeah, so like for example, the high impact areas, that's going to be all hospitals. And so, and like for example, a lot of the hospitals in New York will probably get money from that because it's going to be based on how many COVID patients you're treating and how impacted your system is.
And then for that treatment for uninsured, yeah, you might get money if you treated uninsured patients, but it's only specifically for for treatment of COVID-19.
Exactly. A treatment and I believe also testing for COVID-19, which probably a lot of home infusion providers won't be doing.
And then there's also the rural healthcare providers as well as the Native American Health Service. So, if you are a home infusion provider that is part of a hospital, your hospital may get some of this targeted allocation, but I just don't know if the sort of the standalone home infusion provider is going to be eligible for these targeted allocations. That being said, based on, our FAQs and this webinar, you think that you definitely might be eligible for the targeted allocation. Certainly it's worth it to reach out to one of us to see if you are eligible. I don't think that specific guidance has been released yet, but there's been a trickle of information related to this. So, for example, for the treatment of uninsured, you apply for that money on the HRSA website, and there's certainly a lot of information related to that. So, both Eric and I do monitor that. So, if you do think that you are eligible for some of this targeted allocation, definitely, give us a call and ask a question.
So as we were talking about in our last webinar, and Kyle Gilster gave us a legislative update about, there was a bill in Congress. It was just called the Paycheck Protection Expansion Program Act. The final version that was signed was called the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act, which is a mouthful to say. So the final bill allocated $75 billion to 8 hospitals, $25 billion to the federal government and states to expand coronavirus testing. And then there was also $310 billion to add additional funds to the Paycheck Protection Program, which had run out of money. And then $60 billion for the economic injury disaster loans. As of right now, because the $75 billion is allocated to hospitals, it doesn't seem that that would help most home infusion providers that are standalone. But Wakaba, can you talk about some of the options that home infusion providers might have?
Yes. First of all, though, as an aside, when we talk about 25 billion to federal government states to expand coronavirus testing, we recently did a webinar about guess HHS guidance related to pharmacists' ability to quote unquote order and administer coronavirus testing. And while home infusion, pharmacies aren't going to go in and open up their closed door pharmacy and begin testing. If you're interested, we have a webinar out there that discusses that HHS guidance. So I thought I'd put a plug in for that. Based on what we talked about, there are other funding options. So, for example, if you didn't get the first 30 billion tranche of money because you didn't get that, now you're not eligible for the next $20 billion. Or you don't fit one of the targeted allocations that we talked about, the other 50 billion, there is still a way for you to be able to get some sort of funding, and that's through that PPP that Erica talked about, as well as the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, or EIDL. PPP is really aimed for small businesses, and it's actually through the Small Business Administration. So if you wanted to get a PPP, you need to go to your SBA approved lender and apply. It's got really great terms and low interest rate, so that's one way. EIDL, you apply through the SBA website, and you will get an automatic. It's $10,000, right, Erica?
Yeah, if you apply for the emergency grant.
Yeah, it's $10,000. You get that within 3 days. You don't have to return it. I will say that PPP definitely has, well, not just the PPP, I should back up, but in terms of the general allocation, there certainly are strings attached to it. Just because it's a grant, it doesn't mean that you can use it for anything and everything. There's a lot of money that's going out to providers, and while it is meant to stimulate the economy so that you survive this pandemic financially, I think that the government is going to have to be able to recoup this money somehow at the end of all of this. And so, what's going to be really important is for you to keep really good records of how you use the money, why you're justified in receiving the money, and then at the end of the day, so that you can show them, how you used it and have really good record keeping. So if you have questions about, what can I use this general allocation money for, please let us know. We're happy to help. I started talking about the PPP. That also has strings attached to it. There's only certain costs for which you are eligible to use the PPP money. EIDL is a little bit broader, but of course it's the government's money, so there are certain terms and conditions always attached. So this is great, but we do caution that you pay particular attention to what that money was intended to provide.
That's such a good point, Wakaba. And with the PPP, if you use it for the wrong thing, the forgivable portion just converts to a loan. But with the provider relief payments, if you use it for the wrong thing, you could have potential false claims liability, though, they haven't come out and said that yet. So you just want to be really careful. That's a great point. Thank you so much for listening. We understand that this is a really difficult and confusing time for everyone, and especially because these guidance keeps changing minute by minute and even browser by browser. So to the extent that you have specific questions, we would be happy to help you.